Good day. A few days ago, when I did a program about the new Russian S-500 air defense system, I said that this year, 2021, has been particularly rich from a military technology point of view, especially with respect to Russia. And sure enough, almost directly after I did that video, there was news about the new Russian light fifth generation fighter, the Checkmate, which is being designed by the United Aircraft Corporation of Russia and its Sukhoi design office, and which was revealed at the MAX Air Show. And it seemed appropriate, therefore, that I should do a program about that. Almost simultaneously with the announcement about this new fighter jet, we had news from the Arctic, from the area of the Arctic known as the White Sea, which is essentially part of the Arctic which borders upon Russia and which is controlled by Russia. We learned that Russia's new hypersonic anti-ship missile, the Tsirkon, had been launched from Admiral Gorshkov frigate, that this was apparently the fourth in the tests of this series of having this missile system launched from a frigate, from a surface ship, and that it is in fact probably the last such test, and that the frigate, and rather the missile, is due to enter service with the Russian Navy next year. And moreover, we were even told which would be the ship that would be the first to carry this missile system on combat duty. It is the Admiral Golovko, which is another Admiral Gorshkov class frigate, a sister ship of the Admiral Gorshkov itself, the ship which carried out this test in the White Sea. And in fact, Tsirkon is a strategic game changer, much like the S-500 system that I talked about. And what makes it a strategic game changer is that it is hypersonic. Now, I think it's worth discussing again a few things about the system and perhaps the history of anti-ship missile systems. But before I do, I again make that traditional comment that I make at the start of every video like this, that I do on military technology developments, which is that I'm not someone who has served in the military. I'm not a scientist or a technologist or a technically minded person or an engineer, and that what I say is based entirely on open sources and discussions which take place, and also is informed to some extent by my own historical knowledge and, if you like, common sense. Others who want to take issue with any of the things I have said in this program and who may have much more extensive knowledge about these weapon systems and technologies than I do are very welcome to discuss these points and to comment about them on the threads of these videos. I've seen some already very interesting comments appear there, and I hope that more of you will in fact do so, especially those of you who either have technical backgrounds or who have served in the military, neither of which I have or have done. So let's get on to discussing this system. And I think, again, it's perhaps important to say that, as is the case with surface-to-air missiles, which really go back to the 1950s, and the Russian S-25 program that was developed in the early 1950s to develop Moscow, and which provided the high technology and industrial base upon which Russia has built in order to produce ever more sophisticated and ever more diverse anti-air defense missile systems. So in a way, it is the same with anti-ship missiles. Anti-ship missiles, as we know them in the modern world, are essentially a Russian invention. And it's, again, very much like happened with the S-500, the Stalin period, the late Stalin period, where we need to go back and look to and see what happened. And in fact, what was the case at that time was that the Russians ended the Second World War with a situation rather like the one in the air, where they were massively outmatched by the immeasurably more powerful US Navy of that period. The US Navy at that time had aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, frigates in abundance. The Soviet Navy of that period was, by contrast, badly damaged as a result of the Second World War. Such battleships as it had dated either from the Tsarist era or were ships that had been acquired from Italy as a result of reparations after the war, and which, by the way, were to be lost very quickly in a somewhat mysterious accident. There were some cruisers and some destroyers, and there was an extensive fleet of diesel-electric submarines, though of rather outdated specifications. And in any event, it was obvious to Stalin and to his officials, and including to the Russian Navy, that the Russian Navy was comprehensively outmatched by the US Navy, and given the technological and industrial realities of that time, there was no prospect that the Russian Navy would ever catch up in any foreseeable future. And by the way, this has tended to be true ever since. The Soviets developed to a very great degree their nuclear submarine force, which I discussed also in a recent program for this channel. And it's arguable that by the 1980s, they had drawn level with the Americans in nuclear submarine technology, and certainly in numbers of submarines. And it's also fair to say that from the 1960s, the Russians did make a major effort to build up their surface fleet, and in the 1980s they were starting a program of building nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, though it is important to say these were different in many respects from the US Navy supercarriers of that period and indeed of today. Again, I've discussed carrier developments in a recent program in which I've just spoken about the current standoff, naval standoff in the Pacific, and the Chinese nuclear carrier program, which we're now starting to see beginning to form. So at no point in the Soviet period or during the Cold War did the Soviets have an oceanic navy that actually compared with that of the United States. These carrier programs that the Soviet Union embarked on came very late, and in any event they would not have resulted in carriers comparable to the US Navy supercarriers. And even if the Soviet Union had survived, it would have taken decades in any event before the Soviets could have drawn level in terms of numbers of carriers, if they were ever likely to, which is frankly doubtful. Anyway, history intervened. The Soviet Union, as we know, collapsed, and the Russian Navy that emerged from that collapse is the subject that we're going to talk about shortly in this video. But anyway, going back to the early 1950s, that was the situation that the Soviet Navy faced at that time. That was the situation that the political leadership led by Stalin faced, and the Soviets made certain decisions, and they were very similar decisions in some ways to the decision that was taken to build an air defense missile system around Moscow and to start to develop a air defense system based on missiles. They looked to try and draw level, or at least to counter the immense American superiority in warships by looking for a technology which could destroy those warships. And what they did in the early 1950s was develop the anti-ship missile. And we've seen, or rather people who are familiar with these things will know of some of these very early Soviet anti-ship missiles. They were large, cumbersome, liquid, powered by liquid-fueled rocket engines, which are extremely tricky to operate and to launch. And they had, at that time, relatively low performance. And NATO gave them all sorts of names like Styx and Kennel and whatever. But they did start to appear, not just in the Soviet Navy, but in navies which were supplied by the Soviet Union in the 1960s. And in fact, in the 1960s, in 1967 to be precise, in an event which is connected to the Six-Day War, but which is not actually a part of it, the anti-ship missile, one of these early Russian Soviet anti-ship missiles, the Styx, was used in action for the first time when an Egyptian Navy missile boat launched one of these early missiles against the Israeli destroyer, Eilat, and was able to penetrate Eilat's defences and cause it to sink. And this happened in 1967, and it drew the world's attention for the first time to the challenge and threat that was posed by these anti-ship missiles. And I should say that at that time, Soviet anti-ship missiles that were based on ships, as well as being large and cumbersome and difficult to use, were also slow. They were, none of them were faster than the speed of sound. But at this time also, we start to see a division, and we start to see the Russians, much as they started to develop air defense missile systems for their ground forces, their army, which were separate from those that were used by their homeland-based air defense, they started to develop anti-ship missiles to be launched from aircraft and anti-ship missiles to be launched from submarines. And these tended to be larger, more sophisticated, more powerful, and above all faster than those which were at this time used on surface warships. And indeed, you started to, these missile systems, these supersonic missile systems, as some of them were, started to appear on Soviet bombers, which were targeting US Navy carriers in the 1960s, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And the Soviets simultaneously began to field anti-ship missiles, less complex, slower. Most of them at this time could not reach the speed of sound, from their submarines. They were designing at this time special cruise missile submarines that were used to launch anti-ship missiles, principally targeting American warships, probably not the carriers, more probably the escort ships which were surrounding the carriers. And this was something that was beginning to develop in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it's perhaps important to say that at that time, the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were very few anti-ship missiles of any sort in the West. Those which were developed at great speed after the Eilat incident in 1967. But of course, they didn't match the full range of anti-ship missiles that the Soviet Navy had. The US, by the way, was, as I said, particularly slow in developing anti-ship missiles of its own. In the 1970s, an anti-ship missile system called the Harpoon appeared, which is still in service with the US Navy. It's a much more advanced, much shorter and easier to use and more flexible system than these very large, cumbersome 1950s era Soviet anti-ship missiles that I was talking about. And it started to appear in the 1970s. And of course, the French developed an anti-ship system called the Exocet, which was used very effectively by the Argentine Air Force in the early 1980s during the Falklands War between Argentina and Britain. And at this time, the Western anti-ship missiles also had a particular advantage over the Russian anti-ship missiles, at least the ship-launched ones, in that they operated very close to the surface of the sea. They were sea skimming, to use the the phrase, and that made them difficult to track by radars upon ships, and made it easier for them to penetrate through to the ships than was true of the rather cumbersome and elaborate and heavy and big Russian anti-ship missiles that had started to appear after the 1950s. And in fact, the Soviets did not go down the same road as the West did in the 1970s. They don't seem to have been so interested in developing sea skimming, subsonic anti-ship missiles. They went instead for supersonic missiles. Supersonic missiles of the sort that they were already in the late 1960s launching from their aircraft, and supersonic missiles that in the late 1970s and early 1980s they began to install in their warships. And around this time, two important classes of warships began to appear: the Kirov class battle cruisers and the Slava class large missile cruisers, and both of them were equipped with advanced supersonic anti-ship missiles, some of which had a political ancestry going back to the 1960s, but some of which were very advanced for the period, had all kinds of complex electronic systems, and which would have posed a very considerable challenge to the US Navy of that period. However, it's important to say that the cost of going supersonic in the 1970s was that one had to go large, and the Soviet supersonic anti-ship missiles of the 1960s and 1970s and early 1980s, rather like their subsonic anti-ship missiles of the 1950s, were very big indeed. And that partly explains why ships like the Kirov class battle cruisers and the Slava class cruisers were very large ships. And it also meant that there were difficulties installing these anti-ship missiles, these supersonic anti-ship missiles, on submarines, and the cruise missile submarines that the Soviets did field in the 1980s, which were capable of launching these supersonic anti-ship missiles, the so-called Oscar class, like the surface ships, were also very large. But then what has happened since then is that there has been a revolution in chemistry, especially, obviously, in this case, we're talking about Soviet chemistry, and new rocket engines could be developed which could provide supersonic speeds and which enabled first Soviet and then increasingly Russian anti-ship supersonic missiles to become much smaller. And along the way, it also became clear that it would be possible to install special jet engines on some of these missiles, making them in a kind of way flying as opposed to just missiles that uses rocket engines. And you started to see in the 1980s missiles that could be called cruise missiles, air-breathing, with engines, aircraft-like engines, starting to appear, first in the Soviet and then increasingly in the Russian navies in increasing quantities. And all of these developments continued after the Soviet Union fell, and it seems that they were given renewed energy after the stabilization of the Russian economy, which took place in the early years of President Putin's government, and these programs have continued and intensified ever since. And what we now have is a situation where Russian warships are now in a position to field 3 different types of missiles. One is a traditional cruise missile, which is the Calibre, which is a subsonic cruise missile, rather like the US Tomahawk. It's intended principally for very long-range strikes, principally against land targets, and it's been deployed and used regularly by Russian Navy warships to target jihadi groups in Syria, especially their logistic bases, their ammunition dumps, their bases, that sort of thing. And that's become a fairly widely known and widely used weapon system. And then alongside the Calibre, there is also a rocket-based missile, the Onyx, which is supersonic but relatively small, and which can also be used and used very effectively against surface warships, though it can also be used importantly against land targets, as has recently been confirmed. But its principal use is as a ship-launched anti-ship missile. And both Calibre, the subsonic long-range Calibre, and the supersonic Onyx, which is not as long-ranged as the Calibre, but has still got a significant range, they can both be carried by the new Yasenem submarines that I did that program about recently. And now, alongside these 2 other missile systems, the Calibre and the Onyx, we have the Tsirkon, which is a different creature again. It is apparently, and this is something we've gleaned, it seems, from the video that the Russians have displayed of its launch. It's launched from the ship vertically into a vertical climb into the higher atmosphere, using firstly a sort of gas cold launch technique that propels the missile out of the launch tube with gas, and then the rocket engine fires, takes the missile further up into the higher atmosphere. Then the missile is corrected by small rocket engines around the nozzle, and then which direct it to place it in the correct direction for the target. And then importantly, an air-breathing scramjet engine takes over, and it flies towards the target at hypersonic speeds. Now, Onyx, the supersonic system, can perhaps fly at twice, or some people think 2.5 times the speed of sound. Tsirkon can fly, well, some people say at 7 times the speed of sound, others say at 9 times the speed of sound. There's different views or theories about this. And because it's air breathing and operates rather high in the atmosphere where there's little resistance, it can apparently keep flying at that kind of speed for a significant time and over a substantial range. And again, there's debates about the range. Some people put it at 500 kilometers. So far, all tests have been, all the tests that the Russians have announced have been at a maximum range of 500 kilometers. 350 to 500 kilometers seems to be the test range, but there are suggestions that it can actually fly much further, with some people saying that it can fly for up to 1,000 kilometers, which would make it a very long-range weapon system indeed. And there is again some uncertainty about the way in which it would attack a warship. Some suggest that it would attack from high altitudes and then fall onto the warship in a very steep, almost vertical dive, which would make it very difficult for the anti-ship missiles of a warship to intercept. But others say that it can be corrected, that it will dive whilst still outside the ship's radar range, close to the sea, and it would approach the ship in a kind of sea skimming trajectory, as by the way it's known that Onyx and Calibre can do, and that it would attack the ship in that way. Nobody really knows, and we shall no doubt eventually find out. But regardless, it's quite likely that this is going to be a devastating weapon. At this moment in time, at this precise moment in time, there doesn't seem to be a weapon system, an air defense weapon system, installed on US Navy warships or on the warships of any Western Navy, which is capable of defeating the Tsirkon missile. And of course, Tsirkon is not the only hypersonic anti-ship missile that the US Navy has to face. There is the much bigger and much more powerful Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched missile carried by the MiG-31 fighter bomber jets in the Russian Air Force. That can certainly be launched over long ranges and has been displayed and is already in service. And of course, there is the Chinese hypersonic glide vehicle, which is also apparently due to enter service shortly, and which can be launched against US Navy warships and including aircraft carriers from the Chinese mainland, and which will no doubt make the seas bordering the Chinese mainland very difficult to penetrate for US Navy warships once it is deployed, and certainly if it was ever used in a hostile situation. So Tsirkon is only one in a family, or rather a grouping, of hypersonic missiles that is now being deployed, but it is perhaps in some ways, if not the most dangerous, at least the most insidious, in the sense that it can be launched from relatively small warships, including, it seems, missile boats and certainly Russian Navy frigates, and it is probably, in fact almost certainly, much cheaper to build than these other hypersonic systems, missiles that I was talking about. So it is likely to start to appear in increasing numbers, firstly in warships of the Russian Navy, and then conceivably in the warships of other navies too. And one possibility obviously has to be the Chinese Navy. And that would of course multiply for the US Navy the threat of hypersonic missiles. They could be attacked with hypersonic missiles simultaneously from land and by sea. Some of them might be hypersonic glide vehicles. Some of them might be ship-launched, surface ship-launched. Some of them might be launched from submarines. It's conceivable, it's not impossible to see how the US Navy would find itself at that point under extraordinary threat and tremendous challenge. And as I said, at the moment, it has no air defense system which is capable of countering any one of these missile systems, and it's not clear at the moment whether any such system can be developed or produced in any period of more than 5, 10, perhaps even longer years. So this does change the naval balance, and unsurprisingly, perhaps the Pentagon has now issued a comment discussing and talking about how this test of the Tsirkon missile system in the White Sea by the Russian Navy is destabilizing. A comment which I have to say I find extremely strange, coming from the United States. Why is it destabilizing for Russia, or indeed China? to test new weapon systems and not destabilizing for the United States to do that. And of course, the White Sea, as I said, is a part of the World Sea and Ocean, which adjoins Russia, whereas the United States, as we know, and its allies, like Britain, as we also know, feels free to conduct naval exercises very close to the Russian and Chinese coasts, as the British and the Americans and other countries have recently been doing in the Black Sea. So why are these Russian actions destabilizing and the American and NATO actions in places like the Black Sea and in the South China Sea, why are those not destabilizing? Well, it's a rhetorical question. We all know the answer. What the United States does in its own self-perception is, of course, never destabilizing. Only what its enemies do is destabilizing. And that's why the United States can say with a straight face that Russian steps to test a missile in waters adjoining their own country is destabilizing, whereas the United States holding naval exercises close to the Russian coast is not. But putting these points to one side, I suspect that there is another cause for US concern. And that isn't just the fact that this missile system, Tsirkon, is very potent and perhaps a serious threat to the US Navy, but it is the location of this particular test. And that is, it seems that the Russians conducted this test in the Western Arctic, in that part of the White Sea, which in effect is the one where the United States Navy is most likely to operate in the event of a military confrontation with Russia. And given that there are growing concerns on the part of the United States that the Russians, who after all are the country with by far the biggest land border along the Arctic Ocean, are beginning to establish an overwhelming and perhaps unchallengeable military superiority in the Arctic, it's conceivable that this is what has dismayed and alarmed the United States. It could feel that with the development of these anti-ship missiles, the Arctic waters are in effect being closed to them in the event of a confrontation, a military confrontation with Russia. Anyway, that's all I think one can say for the moment about the Zircon anti-ship missile. It certainly exists. It will be entering service next year, and it will be entering service on Russian Navy warships. And by the way, just to round this video off in terms of its technical aspect, it's perhaps worth saying something about the surface ship that these missiles are currently being launched from, which is the Admiral Gorshkov class frigate. Now, the Russians refer to this warship as a frigate, and at about 4,000 tons displacement, it is, by comparison with some American and Chinese warships, relatively small. But perhaps, though the Russians call it a frigate, it would be better classified as a pocket destroyer. It's relatively small, but it carries an enormous punch. It carries an enormous punch in terms of its anti-ship missiles, which, as I said, depending on the particular target that it is operating against, can be Calibre or Onyx or shortly Zircon. And it has a very advanced anti-aircraft missile system based on the land-based S-350 system, and this in its naval form is called the Polyment Redoute, and it is an extremely advanced system, some say at least comparable, perhaps even more advanced than the Aegis system found on US Navy destroyers. The reason the Admiral Gorshkov is relatively small is because of the limitations so far of Russian naval dockyards. They are up to now only able to build ships of relatively small displacement, since some of their big dockyards that they used to have in the Soviet period were located in Ukraine and are therefore lost to them. But the reports say that the Russians have been working very hard on increasing the size of their dockyards in St. Petersburg, in the Arctic, in Severodvinsk, also, by the way, in the Far East, where they are building a massive new shipbuilding complex in Kamchatka, though that seems to be primarily intended to build merchant ships. But it seems the changes in developments in Russian naval dockyards will allow the Russians in a few years to start building bigger warships comparable in size to the Chinese and American Navy destroyers, and apparently the plans to do so already exist, and they will be enlarged Admiral Gorshkovs. So we are looking at a very potent warship, very advanced warship. It apparently has certain features like a new hull, a new type of hull which is not all steel but uses carbon fiber in various locations, something which is, by the way, controversial in Russia, with some Russians arguing that it was not appropriate for Arctic deployments, but it seems to have worked fairly well in practice. So we have a new generation of very potent Russian warships appearing, able to carry and operate very potent Russian anti-ship missiles. And of course, as well as these oceanic warships like the Admiral Gorshkov, like the Chinese Navy, but perhaps rather more advanced, the Russians also field very advanced anti-ship missile boats of the Buyan and Karakurt classes, which can also, by the way, operate on rivers and in internal lakes, of which Russia has an abundance. So this is going to be a threat that is going to grow, not just in the submarine force, with Russian Navy submarines able to operate Zircon missiles, but also Russian surface ships, which are probably going to start appearing in growing numbers over the next few years, and which will be able to give a good account of themselves in places like the Arctic and the Black Sea, and in the Pacific, the Sea of Okhotsk, closing off these large bodies of water to the US Navy in the event of a conflict between Russia and the United States. So once again, we see how the position of the US Navy in a field, in an area where it formerly had unchallenged dominance and where there was no real conceivable challenge to the US as recently as 10, 15 years ago, we can see how that is now gradually changing. Well, I've already discussed my own opinion about what the US should do in this kind of situation. I suggested that it seek to agree naval limits. We will see what the US Navy does. But it does need to understand, and this is the last point that I'm going to make, that this is a full spectrum challenge that it is facing. It is a challenge in the air, on land, on the sea surface, and under the sea, with both the Chinese and the Russians increasingly fielding ever more advanced weapon systems and warships and aircraft and missiles and hypersonic missiles on a scale that probably the US Navy 10, 15 years ago could not have imagined. Lastly, and very lastly, I'm going to make one final point. That the Chinese are able to build warships at such extraordinary speed is something that should surprise no one who is familiar with Chinese industrial capabilities. But that the Russians have been able to field over such a short time such a multiplicity of different weapon systems, like the S-500 system, the Yasen submarine, the Tsirkon anti-ship missile, and now the Sukhoi checkmate fighter, demonstrates that the Russians also possessed their technological base and an industrial base. Not an industrial base as large, obviously, as China's or America's, but one which, by the way, is growing rapidly in size and which is becoming very modern as it is being reconstructed from the ground up. Barack Obama or various other people have at various times talked in rather sneering terms about Russia's industrial and technological capability. Barack Obama said that Russia doesn't make anything, and John McCain said that it was a gas station masquerading as a country. Well, it's fairly obvious and entirely clear that this is a wildly exaggerated, indeed not just exaggerated, but entirely false view. The Russians, in fact, make an awful lot, and they are going to be making an awful lot more. They're heavily reconstructing their heavy industrial base, and I suspect that before very long, especially when their aircraft developments become clear, when they start, for example, fielding civil airliners powered by Russian engines, as they're very shortly going to start doing, that will become increasingly obvious also to more and more people. The idea that the United States can win an arms race against China is far-fetched already. The idea that it can take on both China and Russia at the same time is fanciful and fantastic, given that it's not just a Chinese industrial base, which is greater than America's own, that the United States would be challenging, but an industrial base in Russia that is modern, that is developing advanced weapon systems, very advanced weapon systems, and which is growing in size. So that ought to make the United States think very carefully about its options for the future. These policies of trying to take on both the Chinese and the Russians at the same time are misconceived, to put it mildly. They overestimate US power, they underestimate the resources, scientific, technological and industrial, of those countries that the United States has labelled its opponents, and it cannot end well. I think that the United States has considerable time and space to review its options, but that's something it does need to start to do. What it cannot do is drift along trying to take on both the Chinese in the Pacific and in Asia and the Russians in Europe at the same time, and trying to play the one off against the other and think that somehow its good luck will last. Good luck is something that the United States has had in abundance, but to rely upon it indefinitely is to turn that good luck into gambler's luck, which in the end, as everybody who has any experience of that sort of thing knows, it always turns. Thank you very much for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our other channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU, Locals and others. You'll also find links under this video. And can I also say that we have high ambitions for these platforms, which will be rolling out soon. And also support us to the extent that you can via Patreon, Subscribestar and PayPal, and also by going to our shop, buying the amazing things you will find there, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and of course the amazing polo shirts, of which I am currently wearing one. And thank you for joining me today for this program. I suspect that this will be the last of these military programs I will do for a while, though given the pace of change there and the pace at which the Russians are churning out these new systems, who knows? But anyway, I hope, or rather I expect, that it will be the latest. And as I said, do feel free to comment and share your thoughts in the thread to this video. And thank you again for joining me today, and have a wonderful day. And if you like this video, please remember to check the like button, to press the like button, and to check your subscription to this channel. And see you soon.